I'm going to talk about our report that came out in September of this year, looking at GSA's co-working pilot program, which was launched in part in response to increased telework and underutilization of federal office space. GSA started this pilot program in July of 2023, and it is still ongoing. And through the pilot program, basically federal employees can access kind of shared co-working office space in 6 federally owned or leased locations across the country. And you can see that in that map here. At the time of our review, and I believe this is still the case, the space was free to use. So federal employees would contact GSA, note that they were interested in using the space at one of these locations. GSA kind of gives them a kind of introduction on the first day of how to use the space, and then people can kind of show up after that. GSA does ask that folks sign in, and we'll talk a little bit more about this and kind of the issues that came up here. And GSA uses that data, the sign-in data, to calculate usage and then also send a survey basically out to folks after the fact to kind of get a sense of what were their impressions of the co-working space. Did they have any suggestions or needs that weren't addressed there? Um, we were auditing the pilot program in real time, which presented some interesting challenges because it was evolving, and GSA was kind of thinking through how they wanted to do this pilot. But they were super helpful and very open to speaking with us. Overall, what I'm going to talk you through and what our report looked at was how GSA identified and addressed and what did they find with respect to agencies' needs for co-working spaces, any kind of opportunities and challenges presented by co-working, and how GSA might be addressing some of those challenges. And then the extent to which GSA's pilot kind of met these key characteristics that GEO has previously identified for a good kind of pilot program design, basically. Let me drive my slides too. So yeah, for the co-working space feature, so GSA took some steps before they officially opened and launched these pilot locations to understand what would drive people to use the co-working spaces, what would agencies find useful, what would the users find useful. They did focus groups, they did workshops, surveys. They contracted with a real estate services company to understand how does this work in the private sector. And I should note that GSA was doing all of this with practically no budget for the pilot program. So they were really leveraging existing resources. Like he said, what space do we already own or lease that we could, easily set up as a co-working space? Can we use some GSA staff on site to help people use these spaces, things like that? So you can see some examples here. And basically what GSA found in terms of what users and agencies thought were important are kind of fall into basically a few categories. One is technology. So obviously Wi-Fi, but also access to shared printers. I'm sure all of us who work at home understand that. Also rooms with audio and video conferencing capabilities, things like that. The other one was varying space types. So not just, an individual workstation, but also team rooms. If a bunch of people are coming in and they want to have a meeting, there's options for that. Also, even as Keith said, much bigger rooms, conference spaces, training rooms. You can see that in the middle photograph down there for the Tacoma space. And just kind of giving people different options depending on what their needs were. Amenities, things you would expect, kitchens. You can see the break room in the lower right side for the Chicago space, having support staff on site to kind of help deal with things, the thermostat's not working, things like that. Um, and then ease of use, which we kind of lumped a few things in, but things like public transit, is it easy to get in and like check in and things like that. And then privacy and security, having private space for phone calls, having secured access, since these are federal spaces, things like that. So GSA did in each pilot location, try to kind of address those needs, and you can see some examples down there. In terms of kind of opportunities for co-working, so the big one, the one that obviously makes sense given everything Keith has been talking about how much space is not being used and that's being paid for, is cost and space savings. And that kind of shows up in 3 different ways that we talk about in our report. The first one is swing space. Your lease is over, you have a new place that you're moving to, but you've got a gap between the two. In the past, agencies might have done lease extensions, which could be kind of costly. The idea is that if there's a co-working space nearby, maybe folks can use that for a few months to kind of address that gap. And we did highlight an example in the report where the National Park Service used the co-working space in San Francisco in between leases and saved about $1.6 million, according to GSA. The other example is surge space. So where agencies need more space than usual in a location they're not normally at, or just like more employees temporarily are coming into the office and they don't have the space anymore to accommodate them. The example here would be FEMA. You know, a disaster happens, people get deployed. Those folks are out in the field doing disaster recovery, but there's also support staff who are working in offices, usually at that site as well, you know, making maps, et cetera. And instead of renting space from a non-government agency, if GSA had a co-working space available, you know, those employees could go there. The other example is, you know, maybe an agency reduces its office space, but let's say IRS tax season, a lot more people are coming in. They no longer have the office space to accommodate them. Okay, this can be your backup. And then the last one is kind of this longer term vision where we are, you know, where agencies are actually reducing their dedicated space and they are using the co-working space to address things like I need a conference room today, or, you know, like I said, like we've got more people coming in. Okay, we have this option. Or maybe we're just exclusively using the co-working space now. We don't have dedicated space in a certain field location. The other opportunity that came up was flexibility. So, you know, post-pandemic, people have moved all over the place. Some employees are no longer living near where their agencies have offices. So this could be an option where if you have an in-office requirement, folks can go to a co-working space if there's one where they live. Similarly with recruitment, if you're trying to get people who are not living near where you have offices anymore, this could be an option to give them some space where they can at least work around other people, meet in office requirements, things like that. We heard an example from one agency where they have employees who are consistently doing field work in like North Texas. It's not enough to have a dedicated space for that agency, but they were like, you know, it'd be great if there's a co-working space where they could drop in when they're doing that. And then the last one, Keith mentioned this in terms of collaboration. You know, if you've got agencies with similar missions, maybe there's some knowledge sharing, some synergies that you can take advantage of there. In terms of challenges, so the first one, you know, this is a new effort that GSA has started. We're, you know, a little over a year into the pilot. It's going to take time for agencies to really buy into this, to start packaging it into their space planning. So that's going to take time to achieve. And then in the meantime, GSA, you know, will be accruing some cost running co-working spaces. GSA has taken a couple steps to try to address this. One is a tool to help agencies see, like, this is how much you would save if you use the co-working space in this way. The other tool is to help GSA look at locations and say, okay, we've got, you know, X number of agencies with expiring leases in this location. Would this be a good spot for a co-working space if we can get these agencies on board? The second one, mission and compatibility. You know, we have folks working with classified material. We have, you know, like Keith said, there's NASA folks working in labs. Co-working is not going to make sense for them. But for the kind of high security classified work, GSA has taken some steps to have initial conversations with some agencies about the possibility of having high security co-working, shared SCIFs, things like that, that might make sense. The third challenge is agency culture. I think Keith touched on this as well, and employee preferences. Some agencies like having their dedicated space. They may not want to share. Similarly, some employees like having their dedicated space. They may not want to share. And so GSA is continuing its efforts to really use the pilot to outreach to agencies to get an understanding of how can this be of value to you, to your employees? They've mentioned also maybe having the agencies do some employee surveys within their own agencies to understand what might, you know, tip that balance. The last one is uncertainty about co-working. And again, this kind of ties to that first challenge, right? This is early on. Right now, it's free to use. It's not always going to be. GSA has been working with OMB to figure out what is our pricing structure going to be? How are we going to charge agencies for, you know, employees using this space? And I think until that's done, you know, there's still going to be a lot of question marks for the agencies as to whether we're going to do this. And then we also found some agencies weren't aware of the pilot, even though GSA has taken efforts to present on it, to market it. So GSA, you know, is working to have more meetings with agency decision makers, folks who are making the space planning decisions, to increase awareness about it as well. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, and then I mentioned that we also evaluated the pilot program in its current iteration against some prior practices that we had established for, what makes a good pilot design. And overall, we found that of the five, GSA is aligning or partially aligning with most of them. They have measurable objectives for the pilot. They're really trying originally in the initial kind of iteration to understand, how many people are using it, why are they using it, using those kind of check-in surveys to figure out that information. They do have regular stakeholder communication externally. They have been marketing, they have been meeting with agency decision makers. They have monthly meetings with the GSA staff that are running these co-working spaces to get feedback on, what's working, what's not working. They have an assessment methodology, and we did have a partial alignment here because part of that assessment methodology is using those check-in surveys and getting that feedback on that. But it does require that people check in, right? They like scan a QR code basically. And so there were some people who were showing up, they'd already gotten the orientation, so they knew how to use the space, so they would just show up and not check in. I mean, not scan the QR code. So we did make a recommendation that they take steps to make sure they are accurately capturing that usage information, which also affects like can how often they're getting surveys responses back as well. The evaluation plan, they're doing annual end of year evaluations. So we did give them a line there. Now, the scalability is where we had the does not align. And scalability in this context really refers to what criteria are you using to decide we're going to move beyond the pilot stage, we're expanding to new locations, we're winding it down, like this isn't working, things like that. Like, how do you make those decisions and that you're going beyond pilot to kind of more real world implementation? And we found that GSA didn't really have criteria for that. They kind of were more focused on getting this kind of initial how many people are using it? Do people like the individual spaces? But more at a holistic level, we were saying you need to kind of understand early on how you're going to make that decision to scale, because that also affects how you're designing your pilot, the types of information you're getting. And this is not currently really operating in a real world setting because it's free. So it would be good for GSA to have that understanding of how are we going to make that decision, and are we currently designing the pilot in a way that will help us get that information. So we did make a recommendation there to kind of establish that scalability criteria. GSA did concur with all the recommendations. They've said that they're taking steps to address it. So I think it'll be really interesting to follow this and see what happens, especially once that pricing gets finalized.